but other Boer states were created during the 1850s, as the British became distracted by events elsewhere, principally with the Crimean War in Southeast Europe between 1853 and 1856, and the Great Mutiny in India in 1857. As these events occurred, the Boer states of the Orange Free State and the South African Republic were created. They would survive for nearly 50 years, forming a buffer of sorts between the British and the Zulus, and a crucial alternative enemy for the Cape Colony. However, the problem for the Zulus was that there was an ever-growing discovery of resources in the region, including gold and diamonds, which drew ever larger numbers of settlers to the region, such as the notorious proponent of British imperialism in Africa, Cecil Rhodes. As settlement in the region increased, Mpande's successor, his son Cetshwayo, from the very point that he succeeded his father in 1872, faced growing pressure from the British to the southwest. This would culminate in the Anglo-Zulu War, which erupted in 1879, and which has gained major notoriety in the history of European imperialism in 19th century Africa. The Anglo-Zulu War was fought over 6 months between January 1879 and June of the same year. The war has become very well known to Western audiences owing to the 1964 film Zulu starring Michael Caine, as well as the follow-up film Zulu Dawn, which was released in 1979 and featured Burt Lancaster and Peter O'Toole in the lead roles. But these films have conveyed the idea of a kind of Zulu victory in the war. The first film, showing a small British garrison battling against overwhelming odds when attacked by thousands of Zulu warriors, and Zulu Dawn covering the famous Battle of Isandlwana, one of the most significant defeats inflicted on a British colonial army during the 19th century. The reality of the wider conflict, though, is much different, with a swift 6-month campaign in 1879 resulting in a total British victory and the effective destruction of the Zulu Kingdom. The war broke out owing to pressure having been applied on King Cetshwayo in 1878 by Sir Bartle Frere, the High Commissioner of the British Empire in the Cape Colony, in an effort to provoke a war with the Zulu Kingdom. Frere orchestrated a boundary dispute with the Zulus during 1878, and then, in December, he sent an ultimatum to Cetshwayo. The terms of this were outrageous. Frere, for instance, demanded that the Zulu army be entirely disbanded, and that the entire military caste of Zulu society be dispensed with. Christian missionaries were to be given protected status and allowed to preach within Zululand. The most egregious provision, though, concerned the appointment of a British resident as Queen Victoria's representative at the Zulu King's court. It was clear that this resident would be much more than an ambassador, as the ultimatum also stipulated that he should be present when certain courts were held before Cetshwayo. These terms essentially would have amounted to becoming a vassal of the British government of the Cape Colony, and could not be accepted by Cetshwayo. These reservations aside, he was also anxious to avoid a war, and tried to avoid rejecting Frere's ultimatum outright. It was no use though, as Frere's goal had been to provoke a conflict, and when Cetshwayo prevaricated, the British crossed over the border with thousands of troops in January 1879. The British, under Lord Chelmsford, commenced their invasion of Zululand on the 11th of January 1879. It had originally been intended to send approximately 16,000 troops into Zululand in 5 different contingents, but less than 10,000 were eventually mobilized in 3 divisions. Against them, Cetshwayo had roughly 35,000 warriors, but these largely fought with primitive weapons consisting of spears, shields, and some limited use of firearms. Despite their technological inferiority, the Zulus were able to draw first blood and repel the first invasion of Zululand. On the 22nd of January, a force of nearly 20,000 Zulu warriors attacked an isolated column of 1,800 British and colonial troops, encamped near the hill of Isandlwana in the northeast of modern-day South Africa. The British had underestimated the Zulus and failed to set up a defensive perimeter in Isandlwana. Sheer numbers did the rest. The Zulus' lack of military technology compensated for by outnumbering the British 11-1, while the Zulu bullhorn battle formation was used to encircle and surround the British troops. During the final clashes of the engagement, the British ran out of ammunition and the confrontation descended into fierce hand-to-hand fighting, in which the Zulus were at less of a disadvantage militarily. In the end, only a few hundred of the 1,800 British and colonials escaped from the Battle of Isandlwana. Approximately 1,300 lay dead across the battlefield. However, there are no accurate figures for the Zulu dead and wounded, but it is believed that the rough estimations of the time extended into the thousands. The defeat, the largest suffered by a British force against such a poorly armed indigenous army up to that time, was only partly assuaged by the successful repulsion of a force of approximately 3,500 Zulus by 150 British soldiers at Rorke's Drift, a mission station nearby, the following day. The two events, the Battle of Isandlwana and the Battle of Rorke's Drift, are the central events of the films Zulu Dawn and Zulu, respectively. The defeat at the Battle of Isandlwana ensured that the first invasion of Zululand could not meet with success, though some of the other detachments continued to operate around the border with Zululand into the spring of 1879. Then, in the early summer, Lord Chelmsford, who knew he was to be revoked from his command shortly, in an effort to save face after the disaster at Isandlwana, led a second invasion into Zululand. This one was eminently more successful, not least because Chelmsford brought a much greater army with him, in excess of 20,000 men. Rapid progress was made, culminating in the Battle of Ulundi on the 4th of July 1879. Here, some 4,000 British and colonial troops squared off against the 13,000 Zulu warriors at the capital of Zulu Kingdom. Here, a disciplined advance by ranks of British gunmen, aided by Gatling guns, rendered the Zulu battle tactics completely ineffective, and the Zulu warriors eventually fled from the region. In the end, just 10 British soldiers had been killed, while over 500 Zulus lay dead across the battlefield of Ulundi, and 1,000 more were badly wounded. Victory at Ulundi effectively brought the Anglo-Zulu War to an end, and also ended the independence of the Zulu nation, which Shaka had built over half a century earlier. In the aftermath of the war, Cetshwayo was essentially made a puppet king, one who was briefly sent to England for an audience with Queen Victoria. He died in 1884, and despite the best efforts of his son and heir, Dinu Zulu, to preserve the Zulu Kingdom, in part by attempting alliances with the Boer states, Zululand was annexed by the British in 1887. It was the beginnings of a period of rapid centralization and expansion of the British presence in South Africa, which resulted in 2 wars with the Boers between 1880 and 1881, and more consequentially from 1899 to 1902. Following the latter struggle, known as the Second Boer War, the British had become the hegemonic power in the region, approximating to the modern-day state of South Africa. Hence, the kingdom which Shaka had created between 1816 and 1828 lasted for 50 years against British encroachments, but eventually it, like the various Boer states, could not resist the advance of British dominion in southern Africa. How should we evaluate Shaka Zulu in light of the kingdom he created and the fate of the Zulu Kingdom after his death? There is perhaps a tendency to view Shaka today as a romantic figure who bravely tried to build up a centralized Zulu kingdom which could withstand the impending onslaught of the European aggressors. But this is to give Shaka far too much credit. There is no denying the brutality of European imperialism in Africa during the 19th century, but this was really only starting at the time of Shaka's rise to power. During the first half of the 19th century, when Shaka reigned, the European presence in sub-Saharan Africa was largely confined to some limited coastal regions like the Cape Colony, the Gold Coast, as well as the port towns along the west coast. It was not until the 1860s and the 1870s that the real scramble for Africa began. As such, while the Zulus and Shaka would have been conscious of the European presence in the form of the British and the Boers to the southwest, and were also increasingly in direct contact with them as traders, they would not have perceived them as an existential threat to their way of life in the 1810s and 1820s. Given this, we might perceive Shaka as a powermonger, one who built up the Zulu Kingdom not as a way of resisting the white man, but purely for his own gain. Virtually his entire career was spent making war on his own fellow Bantu people, and while there is little denying his capabilities as a war leader, And while his centralization of the Zulu state in order to make it a more effective war machine was undoubtedly impressive for its time, the simple fact is that Shaka killed tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of individuals in order to further his desire for power. Then, having attained that power, like so many other autocrats in history, he slipped into delusional behavior and bloodshed. Such was the figure who created the Zulu Kingdom. But there is no denying that that same kingdom was able to inflict one of the most substantial military defeats on British forces in Africa during the 19th century. That, more than anything else, has left an indelible impression on the public imagination concerning the Zulu Kingdom, which Shaka first brought to power in southern Africa. What do you think of Shaka Zulu? Was he a vicious warlord who built his power through conquering his fellow Bantu people, or was he an African hero who succeeded in establishing a kingdom which was able to resist European encroachments for decades after his own death? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Thanks for watching, and please remember to like, subscribe and share this video to stay updated with the latest breaking news from DesBuzz24.